There we go. How's it going,
Hi.
David?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining live with me.
Sure. Let me
We've got
set this
got
up.
some people coming on. We'll just wait a few minutes to get some more people on here, and then we can kind of start asking questions. I already said there's a question box at the bottom that people can kind of submit to, which is a little bit easier to see than all of the comments down below. But people are kind of commenting as they go, and I can also scroll through some more official questions that we can go through. How's quarantine? Are you
Uh,
are you trying to stay creative or busy, or how are you doing with that?
yeah, I'm editing the 11th edition of the ASC manual, so it's like a 700-page book, so it's a lot of work, and luckily it's a little behind schedule, and this quarantine is oddly allowed me to catch up, get a lot of editing done. So um, I'm working on it with Rob Hummel, who is the editor on I think the 8th edition. So it was just too much work for me to do it by myself. So Rob and I split up the work. So that's what I do, that half the day, and the other half of the day I go out and pull weeds out of my yard. So
Walk
my
your dog.
my yard is the best weeded it's ever going to be in its life. So,
Well, that's interesting. What does that look like to edit that? Are you adding new information? Are you
yeah,
taking
I
things out?
it's hard to say. It's like, I want to just roughly say it's like a third new, third heavily rewritten, and then the third pretty straightforwardly transferred from the last edition. So it roughly works out
Got,
that way. So
got it.
it's just complicated because it's all sort of a volunteer done, and the writers are all volunteers. So I have to get either people who wrote the previous article to come back and do a rewrite, or find a new author to do a rewrite, or a new version, or a completely new article. Um, so
That
it's
sounds like a lot of work.
yes, a
I'm
lot of
sure
work.
it's time
And at
consuming.
the end of the book is like hundreds of pages of charts that I have to go through and see if they're accurate and need to be updated, and then find someone to do that work. But right now, I'm just finishing the text portion of the book, so
Oh, great.
just
What do you
here.
have a date? Do you know when that is supposed to be done by, or is that a
It was
secret?
supposed to be done,
Got it.
last year, but but it's we're just pushing as fast as we can to get it wrapped up before I get sent back to Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
Got it. Is
Um,
that oh, so season four starts shooting pretty soon? Was that
well, it was supposed to. I was supposed to leave next week originally,
man?
so now that's delayed. So I don't know.
What does that look like? I mean, you guys, of course, I'm sure prepped for that whole season. Was it? I mean, because you have this gap, do you think is that going to be weird, kind of having to go back over things, or are you still trying to kind of work on taking care of the prep that gets done for that?
Well, we didn't start any prep really this new season because it was supposed to start, and now everything in New York is shut down. So there was, there's been prep with, I'm sure, art department, but from my end, there's no prep has started yet. So
Got it.
it's just delayed.
Got it. Okay, that's a
Yeah,
bummer. Yeah,
yeah.
sitting around. Yeah. Well,
Well,
why don't
I'm
you?
getting the
I'm.
manual done, so
Yeah. I've never heard your story about kind of how you came up. Would you mind kind of sharing how you discovered cinematography and maybe photography and things like that, and going to school?
um, it's funny with photography. I didn't take it up seriously until recently. My father, when he was in the Navy, was the unit photographer as well as pilot, and so I grew up around the camera. Um, but myself did not get into taking a lot of photos until recently. Being in New York half the year for the last 3 years, and the time I did Smash in New York 7, 8 years ago, I just loved taking pictures in New York. So it sort of started to become a hobby of mine to take pictures. But cinematography is something I sort of fell into through just filmmaking in general. I was in high school, I was making short films in Super 8, and then got to college and continued to keep making short films where I did everything, directed, edited, shot them. Um, by the time I went to film school, I was 26, and I'd been making short films for about a decade.
Wow.
So by that point, I got to Cal Arts, and it was clear to everyone that I knew how to photograph a short film, and so I started getting asked to shoot other people's short films, and so I sort of fell into cinematography specifically in film school.
Did you want to direct initially, or was it? And you
Well,
were just
I wasn't too clear about it. I was a different all-around filmmaker, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't specifically pursuing directing, but it was in my mind at the time in film school. But it just quickly specialized, basically.
You just enjoyed making films, kind of in general.
Yeah, I liked the lighting and camera aspect of it most than the editing or some of the other things. So.
Were you pretty into watching movies also? Was it kind of just movies in general?
Yeah, I'm sort of self-taught. You know, like I said, I went to film school. I was 26 and already learned how to do camera work. So while I was in undergrad at UCLA, I was an English major, but I spent a lot of time just watching movies and reading old American cinematographers and textbooks, and then going to see. You know, I'd find an old article on a movie, and then I'd go find the movie, and then I'd reread the article. So it was just all kind of reinforcement, you know.
Got it.
Movies, and then I'd go out and shoot little Super 8 films trying to copy something I saw in the film that I saw. So
That's so cool. Can you share, I mean, what would your opinion be on film school for anybody watching that might be kind of contemplating that? Would you say it was extremely beneficial to you? Obviously, it's going to be different for everyone, and we're all
yeah, you know, sometimes I get these questions like, which film school should I go to? And the trouble is most people have gone to film school, have only gone to one, so they have no experience with the others. Cal Arts was quite an experimental kind of art school. It's not really Hollywood oriented, other than their maybe animation department, but their live action department is more experimental. In some ways that was good because my training was all classical filmmaking, so going to an experimental kind of art school opened me up to alternate ways of thinking about cinema and style, and made me more open-minded about movies in general. So it was probably good that I didn't go to a classic film school that just reinforced everything that I already taught myself. But I went to film school because I'd been making films for like a decade at that point, and I still didn't know how I actually was going to get into the industry. I started to direct and shoot some very low-budget karaoke music videos in my last 2 years before I went to film school. But other than that, I didn't really have an idea of how to make connections and what the first job was going to come from. And by going to film school, after I came out of film school, my first few features were all with Cal Arts graduates. So that got the ball rolling for me. So that was, for me, the main advantage of film school was being opened up to different styles of filmmaking, meeting different people that helped me get work later, and also learning to work on a crew. You know, I was a one-man operation up till then, so having to put it together a crew and work with them was something new in film school. So all those, it was beneficial. It's a question today is, you know, when I went to film school, it was expensive, but expensive was $10,000 a year expensive. It wasn't, now that would be a bargain. So I came out of film school with like about $26,000 in loan debt, which was not hard to pay off. But today I can't imagine people going to places that have $30,000, $40,000 a year tuitions for 3 years, and so it's hard for me to tell someone to go do that, because it's a big financial burden. So I just don't know. I certainly value film schools. That's not so much the issue. It's just whether the value for money is there or not. It's hard to say.
I mean, I guess now that some equipment has become cheaper and really good quality cameras that people can shoot on, like, people are almost, don't need the equipment at the school to make something beautiful, I would say. But yeah, it always nice to have access to a broad range of crew and equipment and things like that. At least in my experience, was really beneficial, especially because I went in having no knowledge of film, which is crazy, and just different stories kind of thing.
Yeah, school gave me access to 16 equipment and a lot of lighting that I couldn't have done on my own. So that was a good thing.
Yep, exactly. What about, would you recommend if people do go to school that they go somewhere where there's an industry kind of to be able to establish yourself?
I would say it would probably be beneficial to go to a production city, a school that's in a production city, so that when you get out of school, you and your fellow graduates will be in the same area and be able to connect with each other and find work for each other and things like that. So, you know, whether that's Atlanta, New York, LA, and in a couple other cities or not, that's certainly, I think, a good idea. Also, a city that has a decent, independent, non-union landscape, you know, because you're not just going to jump right into union films. I did 23 non-union features as a DP before I joined the union. So LA has or had a fairly strong non-union sort of environment or world for feature making, and that gave me my training before I joined the union.
And I feel like it gives you like the opportunity to shadow people or hop on. I mean, I did a lot of AFI sets, things that you get more experience, you know, being in the industry and working with people that kind of already know what they're doing. So maybe helps you to elevate you at a certain point, kind of getting to be in a place where the industry is a little bit more prevalent, I would say. At least it benefited me, and seeking out a mentor and things like that. Like, don't think I would have been able to do that other places. But of course, there's great film schools everywhere, and people get work that want to, kind of thing. Yeah. There's some questions on here I'm going to throw out that people have asked. We'll see what they are. This person says, can you share your methods of working with directors and showrunners who have very specific ideas about lensing, framing, lighting, things like that?
Well, I think, you know, in the job interview process, you'll find out just how specific they're going to be, how open they are. You know, it's often, if it's a TV show, it depends on if you're doing the pilot or you're joining after the pilot, in which a lot of things have been established, and you have to sort of fall into that. So, you know, it's their shows, so you have to kind of embrace their aesthetics that they've designed for the show. The question is, can you make it make sense for yourself? I mean, I've occasionally been on shows where they have ideas that are in conflict with each other. You know, it's like they want a formalistic style where there's all handheld and no marks for the actors, and you're going like, well, that's not formalistic. Then it's the opposite of formal. You know, they want well-composed shots, but they don't want to do certain things that would allow you to get well-composed shots. It's when you're dealing with sort of contradictory ideas is when you really struggle. But if it's just that they have a very strong opinion about using zooms or as telephoto lenses or certain styles, then you have to listen to that and make it make sense for you within the drama of the show. And, you know, that's sort of your job, is to make visual what they have in their heads. You know, it's their show, so to speak.
I was going to ask, I guess, kind of going along with that. I mean, you've shot a lot of, you've day played on a lot of projects as well, like just shooting one episode of something. How is it going into the middle of a show when like a look has already been established? Do you do your homework and kind of watch through a lot of the episodes? Like, how do you come up with the same look?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. You ask them to show you what they think are the episodes, or tell you which episodes are the most perfect for their look, you know, the ones they're most proud of, or they figure are most instructional, or cover similar subject matter or settings, so that you'll see the same sets the way they've been shot before or something. And then you just, like, you know, it's sort of like being back in film school. You just be breaking down the image in terms of lenses and lighting and color and style, and trying to sort of backwards engineer it. And of course, the people who did that are there on set, so you visit the set, and when the gaffer has a free moment, or the camera assistant, and you say, you know, it looks like some scenes you're dropping in like an 8th Pro mist or something like that, and they'll say, oh, no, it's a glimmer glass, and I go, and I noticed in this scene that, you know, this was this way, and the gaffer will explain what they did, or whether it was intentional or unintentional, and you get a sense of what the style of the show is. I've only done it a couple times. Mad Men was particularly. I did one episode of Mad Men, and that's such a strong show stylistically that it was important to match the look, especially if you only do one episode. But the regular DP, Chris Manley, was the director of that episode, so I knew that if I strayed far, he would have, said something. So it wasn't really too big of a problem. Otherwise, I've done pilots where I get to establish the look of the show, which is nice. So like The Good Wife and things like that. And then Westworld, I came in the end of season 1 to do pickup shots, and then season 2 did an episode and 5 months of inserts and pickup shots and scenes. So. But that show's got so many things going on, and every DP working on it is sort of struggling to match each other.
Yeah, I'm so curious because that sounds like such a scary thing to take on, like a look that's already been created, and if it doesn't look similar, anyways, yeah. But that's why they leave it to the pros to do that, because obviously they have the techniques, and I guess you're using the same gaffer.
Well, yeah, I mean, usually, although with Westworld, it's so many units that the main unit is shooting with the main gaffer, and so they assign you people. So you're working with someone else who's been moved up to gaffer, or someone's brought in. But the thing is, if you're working more than a couple of days, you start to get notes from the editor or the director, the producer, about this looks good and this isn't quite our style or stuff, and you start getting feedback too, and you can tweak what you're doing a little bit.
That's always nice. Yeah, cool. Thank you for answering that. I have someone's asking this question. Is it hard to shoot different skin tones? Or I would phrase it maybe more, do you have a technique that you like to use going about lighting for different skin tones?
Generally, the trouble is you light a master shot and you can't have different lighting on each person in the frame, other than you may be able to tweak the exposure. But if they're moving around the room or something, it's just the skin tones are going to be what they are. And generally, I don't mind the diversity of skin tones. If they exist, you want to preserve it.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you get into a close-up and you're intercutting 2 close-ups, you might start to feel, that this person has a little green or in their light, or something is distracting, and you can tweak it on set. But often today now with digital color correction, you can fix subtle differences with just power windows and things. So I try not to sweat it too much, as long as the exposure is good.
Yeah, cool. That's good.
Lighting is exposure, that's a whole other issue, whether someone needs more or less exposure, something like that. But that's not really the color issue so much as an exposure issue.
Interesting. Cool. How does working in TV streaming affect your process versus working on features, maybe in like pre-production or?
Well, there's a couple issues. I mean, in terms of most of the TV shows I've done don't air until after they're finished editing. So you shoot the whole season and then it gets shown. So it's a little like doing a very long feature in that aspect. You're just making, a 12-hour feature instead of a 2-hour feature or something, or a series of 1-hour features, or however you want to think about it. So that aspect isn't quite that different, other than that in a feature, you don't return to sets very often. You spend a week or 2 weeks in a kitchen, and then you're out of the kitchen. You never go back to it. Where on a TV show, every episode you go back to that kitchen. So which is a little interesting, that you keep getting a second or third or fifth shot at relighting the same set and getting to know its quirks. And I'm always pulling this wall, or I'm always getting this light out this corner of this window. And you can refine a lot of things in television because of the way you return to sets. Sometimes you over refine it. The sort of the downside is that you can get an overly polished look where everything is sort of corrected and balanced, and then it starts to feel a little artificial. But the other issue is just prep. You get a lot more prep on a feature, and television you don't get much prep at all, if any. It just normally when you alternate with DPs on, let's say it's a 10-day episode or 2 weeks of shooting, you prep for 2 weeks while the episode is shooting, and then you shoot for 2 weeks, and the other DP preps for 2 weeks, and it works out pretty well. Unfortunately, I haven't had a lot of shows where it's worked out like that. On the first series I did, which was Big Love, I was supposed to alternate, but then our other DP fell ill, and I ended up taking over most of that season.
Wow.
And then same on Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. I shot half of the first season, but the second and third season I shot more like 2/3 or 3/4. And so there were a number of episodes I did back to back with no prep at all. So it's a little easier as you go on in the series because you know the director, you know the locations a little, you know the sets, you know the crew. So you can get away with some missing prep, but it's difficult when you're dealing with a big night exterior you've never visited and not had a chance to walk through. You don't even get to go on the tech scout sometimes. You know, you're shooting the day of the tech scout, so all the keys go off on a bus and come back and tell you, you know. So it's that's hard to do that.
How is it working? I mean, co-DPing Marvelous Miss Maisel with someone else. Do you guys have to sit down and agree on things, or is it kind of like you established the look in the beginning and you're all kind of sticking to that until the end?
Yeah, I mean, I did the pilot, so we established the look in the pilot, and where I have to collaborate the most with the alternating DP is new sets. You know, like we had a casino set for at this third season for episodes 3 and 4, and Jeff Jerry shot episode 3 and I shot episode 4. So we collaborated on the pre-lighting of the casino sets. Things like that. So that's when there's a new set constructed for, you know, in season 2, a whole new set was built, which was Joel's loft inside the clothing factory. You know, half a clothing factory, half a sort of living space, and it had skylights and windows. And Eric Mornier and I, you know, spent time trying to come up with a lighting plan for that set. And the same with the B. Altman makeup department location. That was a set built inside a real lobby of an old bank building. So it was technically a location that we kept returning to. The same thing with the diner in the Upper West Side, the delicatessen. That was a real delicatessen that went out of business, and then we basically cleaned it up and turned it into a set, and we've had it now for 3 years. But again, Eric Mornier and I had to talk about, you know, do we want to go daylight balance, tungsten balance? Do we want to gel the windows? How do we deal with night scenes? How do we deal with day scenes? You know, we basically agreed on the approach, but we have slightly different, you know, styles. I tend to like daylight balance sets, and well, he tends to prefer tungsten balance sets. So, question of whether we gel all the windows tungsten or just light it with daylight, or, you know, it's an interesting discussion because there's certain advantages in both ways, you know.
Did you ever have, besides that particular disagreements over a look of a scene kind of thing?
No, I mean the scenes themselves, that it's up to the individual DP. So everyone is really good at their job, and I always love watching the other DPs work.
Yeah.
In fact, the funny thing was that I was more or less self-taught as a cinematographer, and then I became a DP after film school, or in film school, and so I never saw another DP at work until I did Big Love, and I was alternating finally in the second half of the season with Bill Wages, who came in to finish the season. And for the first time, I actually could sit on set and watch another DP not only work, but light the same sets with the same actors doing similar scenes. It's just like a little mini film school.
That's so cool.
You know?
Yeah.
I'd say, oh, I never thought to put a white card in the ceiling and bounce a Lico and do it. Oh, I wouldn't have thought to do that. And so I learned a lot just in those episodes watching Bill Wages work on Big Love. And the same thing when I, you know, came in on Westworld or Mad Men. You know, you just learn from studying other people. So those times I get to work on other people's shows is like a little going back to school again, which is fun.
Yeah, that is cool. So did you ever have a mentor or of any sort, or you kind of seem like you just came up shooting and doing it on your own?
No, closest to mentor thing to a mentor was Chris Malkiewicz, who's the cinematography professor at Cal Arts. He wrote 2 textbooks that I'd read several years before I went to Cal Arts, cinematography and film lighting. So by the time I got to Cal Arts, I'd memorized his books, and he was giving these pop quizzes every week, and I kept getting these 100% scores on them. So he decided to make me the TA for his classes the 3 years I was at Cal Arts. So for 3 years, I was the class TA for cinematography and the lighting workshop, and Chris was, my teacher and mentor. And later, I got to collaborate with him on the 3rd edition of the cinematography textbook. So he's the closest thing I've had to a real mentor.
Okay. Did you ever get to shadow anyone? I mean, you said, I guess on your show that you collaborated on, you said that was the first time you got to kind of observe another DP. That's crazy that you just did your own thing and you kind of learned.
Every feature I did, like I said, by the time I did Big Love, I had done 25 features. And every show I do, I'd always ask the key grip, the gaffer, the camera assistants, oh, you've worked with Robert Richardson? What's he like? Or you worked with so-and-so? How does he do? I always pick the brains of all the crew members. Whenever I hear that they'd worked with a DP I admired, and just try to figure out, learn from them. So, but otherwise, I learned from reading American Cinematographer and then watching movies mostly.
That's great. Was there any particular film when you were in school that stood out to you cinematography wise, or anything that kind of drove you to film?
Well, my start really was in high school when I saw, it's a combination of things. I grew up watching a lot of science fiction as a kid, Star Trek and Godzilla movies and things. And then in 1977, when I was 15, 2001 came on television, and I read the book already, and I had looked at photos from that movie, and my parents had this gatefold LP album, and it had full of photographs, and I used to just study the photographs from that movie. But I had dreamed of actually seeing the movie, and it came on television in February of 77. And then later that year, Star Wars and Close Encounters came out in the theaters. So that was a big year for just getting me excited about movie making. And I would get all the magazines and, Starlog magazine, other things, and just read about the production. I started studying visual effects heavily at the end of high school. I thought I might want to go into that. So I was reading Cinefex magazine and reading books on special effects and learning about optical printers and matte paintings and that sort of thing. Because I was a sort of artist growing up, I painted, I built models and things like that. So I thought maybe I'll go into special effects. But then I kind of had an epiphany where I was reading about one of my favorite shots in Empire Strikes Back, which was a low-angle shot of the Imperial walkers at sunrise. And they were semi-silhouette. The sky was sort of flaring around them, very dramatic low angle of the 3 walkers looming over the camera lens. And I thought, that's the most realistic looking special effect. And I've seen it. It feels real. And so I read the Cinefex article, and the guy said, oh, it's just photography. I just pointed the model into the sky painting. I overexposed the backing, and I put a fog filter on the camera lens. So I realized it was just all done with lighting. The traditional cinematography is other than the stop motion aspect of it. So I realized that's sort of what I was more excited about, was filters and lighting and things like that. Although studying visual effects for a number of years has been useful.
I was going to ask. Yeah, I'm sure.
When I talk to a production, visual effects supervisor, I understand issues about compositing and mattes and why you can't have this cross this thing and other issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, that's a cool story. Thank you for sharing that. For Maisel, because of its vintage, the era that it takes place in, did you guys consider shooting on film initially? And you might have talked about this in another interview. I just haven't seen anything.
No, it was Amazon. I don't think there was any interest in the showrunner, the creators, to shoot film. Mm-hmm. They'd shot film on the Gilmore Girls. They didn't want it necessarily to look very digital, but they liked working with digital cameras. They've just gotten used to it on their other shows like Bunheads and stuff. So I don't think they wanted to go back to film from that aspect. They liked the long takes they could do on a digital camera. They liked the mobility. They like not cutting. They like, you know, all these things they've come to enjoy with digital. They just wanted it to feel traditional in a way. So, and Amazon didn't have a strong opinion. They just said, well, just don't, if you shoot film, don't make it too grainy because you have to make an HDR version. And HDR and grain can fight with each other a little bit. It can look the grain, or if you add grain, if you do any kind of grain pass on the show, just remember that you're going to have to do one version for HDR and one version for regular SDR because the grain looks more prominent in HDR. But they weren't interested in adding grain either to the image. So we were able to use the Alexa. At the time, Amazon had just switched over from a policy where you had to shoot with a 4K camera like Netflix, where you could shoot 3.2K on the Alexa and bump it up to UHD.
Right.
Which was great because I knew the Alexa would have the filmish look that would make them happy, as well as all the digital advantages. So I shot the pilot on the Alexa, and then we used Alexa Minis for the series.
And I used to work there, so I have experience, I guess, at Light Iron, because Light Iron colored Maisel, correct?
Yeah. Light Iron, New York, yeah.
Yeah. What was there any approach that you took in pre-pro to initially set up for that look? Did you guys create a LUT?
Well, we created a LUT, just like I do on all my TV shows, but the LUT I created is not that unusual. It's essentially a Rec 709 LUT, but just tweaked. I find the Airy Rec 709 at least it used to be on the yellow side with the kind of crunchy shadows. So I usually just start out and I just shoot a DCS 11 chip chart, and I shoot a face separately, and I go to the post house and I shoot the chart in log, and I shoot it in Rec 709 just so we have a reference of what Aries Rec 709 is. And then we look at the chart, we look at the face, and then I create a LUT for dailies for the monitors that is closer to what I want, which is just a little gentler on the contrast and a little less, I would say a little less saturated, although Maisel is a fairly saturated show. But our LUT is not that saturated. A lot of the saturation comes from the production design and the costume. But because we have a DIT on the show, I'm able to do tweaks to our LUT and put those notes in the ASC CDL with dailies. So, you know, if we're filming on a smoky set or an overcast day and I feel like it's starting to look a little washy or dull, I'll say, can you just bump the saturation 10 points or 10%? They'll try it, and I'll say, okay, then put that in the notes to the colorist, and it's okay, we'll get that little boost.
Yeah.
So we're sort of doing some subtle corrections on set from our basic LUT, but the LUT was just created in prep. They just wanted, they didn't want any kind of golden sepia tone faded period look. They wanted it to be kind of vibrant and almost modern, sort of fresh, and so I didn't create a very stylized LUT or anything like that. So I wanted to feel natural. And because we're shooting a lot of the pilot all the pilot on location, I needed a LUT that pretty much used all the dynamic range I could get out of the Alexa, you know, because I was dealing with bright windows and lamps and things all the time.
Yeah. Someone asked what chip chart you said you used, just so you can clarify.
To build the LUT, I just used the basic 11-step DCS chart. It's got a 11-step grayscale, and then around the borders, it's got some other colors like magenta and flesh tone and other things that colorists kind of know the values of. And I feel you shoot that full frame, and then I shoot a person usually lit like half lit, 3-to-1 ratio or something, and then I set all the levels for the chart, and then I flip to the face and I see how those levels look on the face, because you know charts can be misleading. You want to see how it looks on real people, so I keep going back and forth, and I'll tweak the face and I'll see how that looks on the chart, and I'll see, oh, my blacks have shifted to this color or this, and I'll keep going back and forth until I find some happy medium between the levels on the chart and the way it looks on the face.
Very cool. Nice. Thank you.
Now, once I do that, I sometimes, on some shows, have created variations. Like I'll create 2 or 3 LUTs that are, one's a high contrast and one's a low contrast version of that LUT. So when I do get into I can pick the low contrast light, you know, something a little more open, shadow detail or something.
Yeah. Just for everyone that's come in randomly, if anyone has a question for David, he has 20 more minutes. Go ahead and send your questions into the comment box, just because I can't really read them. Sorry, into the question box at the bottom, not the comment section. There's a bunch of questions. It's been hard to kind of read through some of them, but let's see. When it comes to lighting darker scenes, I guess this is one of my questions. Would you tend to light a scene a little bit brighter and then bring it down in post? Does it depend on the camera you're shooting on? How do you approach those kind of?
Well, it's tricky. You know, there's two types. There's different types of darkness. For one thing, there's dim, underexposed, and then there's higher contrast. You know, higher key, shadowy lighting. You know, so there's when director says I want the scene to be dark, I have to get them to clarify. Do you mean lots of black shadows and little areas of highlights, or do you mean just very dim and underexposed kind of look, low contrast and underexposed? Besides that, you know, if you're dealing with sources that like a flashlight or a candle that have its own brightness level, then you have to balance around that. So you have to expose so those objects render the way you need them to render. But when that isn't an issue and the director wants a very underexposed look, what I tend to do is I don't save it for post. What I'll do is I'll light it the way I want it lit, and if he wants it even darker, more underexposed, rather than stopping down the lens, let's say, I will lower the ISO on the camera. So essentially the monitor image and the dailies all come back darker. So, you know, if I drop from 800 ISO to 500 ISO, that's like a 2/3 of a stop drop in brightness, but I haven't actually underexposed the sensor 2/3 of a stop. I've just sort of processed the image darker. So I get a little less noise, and it gets darker on the monitors, it gets darker in dailies. And if in post they suddenly change their minds, like they often do, and say, can you brighten that a little bit? Well, then I'm really just going back up to 800 ASA again. I'm not, you know, if I shot at 800 ASA and they brightened things in post, then I've technically boosted it to 1,000 or something higher. So so basically, if I'm doing a very, like a moonlit room kind of scene, I'll often start at 500 ISO instead of 800 ISO, and that way I know I have sort of noise protection.
Yeah.
It's a little like with film, you know, where it's a little hard to do this in film because the director sees the light levels on set, but they don't see the light levels in the image. They just see the video tap image. But you know, if you're rating a 500 speed stock at 320 ASA, let's say, to 2/3 overexposed, but then you're underexposing your moonlight scene by 2 stops, technically you're really only underexposed it by a stop and a third. So that rating the stock slower is giving you this extra 2/3 of a stop playing area of more exposure. So that's a sort of similar thing in digital. Use a lower ISO to get the noise and recording down.
Yeah.
And,
Awesome.
and again, doing that makes everything darker on the monitors, and so
everyone's seeing what they want. Yeah, to see. Yeah, cool. Have you had instances where an actress has asked you or told you that she wants to look a certain way in terms of filtration and things like that, that maybe didn't match the mood of a scene or anything, where you kind of have to sacrifice in terms of lighting or using like a look that you weren't necessarily intending for something?
Yeah, it's happened not very often. You know, occasionally there's been actresses who want sort of flatter lighting, even if it doesn't make sense for either where the source of the light is in the scene or the mood of the scene. And it's tricky. You know, you're trying to find some compromise that gives you both the mood and flatters them. There's some DPs who just sort of will ignore those sort of requests. But I've always been sympathetic to actresses. It's their livelihood, and they have to feel comfortable when they're acting. And sometimes they feel comfortable when they know the light's in a flattering position, you know. And so there are DPs who put, you know, eye lights on the camera, like an OB, that's dimmed down to the point where it's not really doing anything, but it makes the actress feel like they're being protected, or it's enhancing their close-up a little bit. So if that makes them feel more comfortable so they can act the scene, then that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
I did do one movie where it was a group movie with 10 leads basically, and one actress wanted to be lit a certain way that was independent of everything in the scene and the room and the people, and it was a little odd. I actually had to overexpose her face in every shot with a spotlight, and then in post bring her back down to a normal brightness level, so the overexposure kind of helped sort of wash out and make the details sort of disappear. Also, the brighter light what it would do is wash out the other lighting in the scene. So if everyone else's light would kind of hit her face, her strong key light would kind of overpower their lighting, but then she'd be a stop brighter than everyone else in the scene. And then I'd have to then post power window her back down so she looked like she was the same exposure as everyone in the scene. And that was interesting.
Is that ever a technique that you would recommend to anyone? I think I've just heard that from people where they would say maybe light someone that requests that a stop over kind of thing, just to fill in the shadows. I don't.
Yeah, overexpose. I mean, it was better with film. Film particularly was nice when you would overexpose a close up and then bring it down in post. It's partly because you're putting more detail at the shoulder of the curve of the film stock, and you have less contrast there. So it tended to make everything a little creamier and stuff. Now, sometimes with like a music video or commercial, they actually leave it overexposed. That part of the bleached out, look is part of the glamour look. You look at a lot of old movies like Marlene Dietrich films, and she's always overexposed in black and white. She'd be a stop brighter, over key in the shot, so she's almost glowing in the shot. So it's a very glamorous lighting technique that today is very hard to justify unless it's, when Rachel Brosnahan and Maisel, she's fairly fair skinned, so she tends to be brighter just normally, and she's often standing in front of the spotlight with a microphone, and she's quite overexposed sometimes. That's just naturally motivated by the scene and the lighting. But people say, well, how, do you use any soft lighting in those stand-up scenes? And I go, no, she's just lit with a harsh follow spot. But, a lot of people don't understand that a frontal hard key light can be quite glamorous. It's not necessarily unattractive if it's frontal enough. It can be, especially bright, it can be quite flattering.
Yeah. Do you use specific filters on her? Or
not on her. The show is generally shot with a quarter Hollywood Black Magic. Sometimes I actually have to reduce the filtration on those stand-up scenes because that's the only time we shoot multiple cameras on longer lenses, because we shoot it a little more like a documentary where we set up cameras around the room and shoot her from different angles on the stage. And so once you start going in on a long telephoto lens in a smoky room, the quarter Hollywood Black Magic can look too heavy with the smoke in the air and all that stuff in the zoom lens. So I'd actually have to drop down to an 1/8 Hollywood Black Magic for shots. But otherwise, I don't increase diffusion on close-ups. We don't really do close-ups on Maisel anyway. Our close-ups are waist up, so it's generally not a problem.
Okay, nice. I've got another question from somebody here. Let's see. I'm just gonna do this one. Do you have any books you can recommend to people, I guess, that maybe want to increase their knowledge in cinematography?
It's a tricky question. I mean, you could just see one of my many tech bookshelves here in the house. I pretty much read every book on cinematography there is, and I kind of feel like if you're interested in the topic, no one's going to stop you from reading all the books out there on it. So I could give you the books you could start with, but eventually you should just read them all. When I was in college, I really liked this interview book called Masters of Light. It's a collection of interviews with all the top DPs of the 70s, pretty much, like Conrad Hall and Vilma Sigmund and Storaro. It was written in around 1984. I read that book so many times that all the pages fell out, and I had to go buy a second copy from my bookshelf. So I recommend that interview book. Since I'm interested in film history and the way old movies were shot, there's a book called Film Style and Technology by Barry Salt. It's a British author. He went into the film archives and he pulled down old silent films and old movies, and he would sit there on a flatbed and he would actually analyze them frame by frame. And then he wrote this book. There's chapters where he timed the average shot length of like 100 movies and then charted it out, and it would show you, like people would say, everyone says that His Girl Friday is cut faster than the average movie of the day, but according to his calculations, it's actually, it has the same number of edits as any other typical late 30s film. It's just that it's acted faster, so it feels like it's cut faster, but it actually isn't. But after the first few chapters, he starts to go into decade by decade, like he'll say the 1930s. In this chapter, he'll say, these are the lenses that came out in the 30s, these are the lights that came out in the 30s, these are the film stocks. Because his basic thesis is that style came about from the tools that are available, and the tools developed because of the style. So to understand why 30s films look the way they do, you have to know what lenses and stocks and lights and microphones and all these things that came out and changed the look of movies that year. So I recommend that book quite a bit. I would just skip the first chapter because he has this beef against French film theory. So he decided to devote an entire chapter against the French for some reason. And so you can just skip that and then go straight into the silent films.
That's great. I am currently reading Cinematography, just like that dense textbook by Blaine Brown, and that
yeah, that's a good book.
Yeah, and I'm loving it. Just sitting at home, I'm trying to go straight through it. Like, it is dense, but you know, I didn't ever get a master's or anything, so I'm just trying to increase knowledge however I can, and kind of fill in the gaps that I think I might be missing. So that's a great book that I would recommend.
Yeah,
I'm really enjoying. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's fun. I read old textbooks partly because I want to know what how older movies were shot. And there's a book that was published in the early 70s by Russell Campbell called Practical Motion Picture Photography. And what's interesting, it's just a kind of dry textbook on cinematography, early 70s cinematography. But he peppers it with quotes by British cinematographers talking about work on the set, that they had to do filters, lighting situations. And they're fascinating little paragraph stories, anecdotes, but he doesn't say who's talking. He just puts a footnote. And if you go to the end of the book and you read the footnotes, you go, oh, that's Freddie Francis. Oh, that's Ozzie Morris. Oh, that, you know, it's some of these top British DPs, but he doesn't credit them in the text. You got to read the footnotes at end notes at the end of the book. So I find that fascinating because I love British cinematography. So but again, they're dealing with, you know, slower film stocks and styles that are no longer, some of it doesn't exist anymore, but I still find it fascinating.
Very cool. Yes. And you said you just kind of started getting into photography more recently.
Yeah.
Did you buy a camera specifically to start shooting photography? Did you already own one, or?
Well, I've always owned some cameras, but I got a DSLR for the first time. I was in Chicago doing the Chicago Code Pilot, I think, or maybe, yeah, it was the Chicago Code Pilot, and the first Canon Rebels had come out, so I bought one of those because I thought maybe I can use it as like a stunt camera or crash camera, and I started to take pictures around Chicago with it. And when I went to New York to do Smash in 2011, that was my main camera. But then I switched to the Nikon D600 the next year because that was the first affordable full frame sensor DSLR. So I shot for years for that Nikon D600. Now I just switched to a Nikon Z6. So
yeah, I love the New
but
York.
I have a bunch of other cameras now I've collected. I have a infrared converted Sony A6500. I have a regular Sony A6400 because I realized I needed a backup camera for my Nikon. And I'd already invested in Sony lenses, so I have the Sony APS-C cameras, and I have my Nikon Z6 camera. And then I got as a gift from the Sherman Palladino's on Maisel, a Fuji film X100F, which is a little APS-C camera with a fixed lens. It's a great kind of street camera. So I use that too.
Very cool. Have you ever done darkroom?
Not since college. I took a class in black and white still photography and did my own processing and printing.
I used to love darkroom. I think I took it. I think they still offer it in high school, but I took so many years in high school and college, and that was like one of my favorite life experiences ever. So if anyone has the chance to do that, like that was, yeah, some of my favorite times were spent in a darkroom, like developing my own photos. Such a good time. Do you have any sets of lenses that you've fallen in love with over the years that you always love shooting with? I'm sure you like to experiment, but
yeah, when film was the most common way to shoot features, I guess because had read so many books and magazine articles, I wanted to try everything. So yeah, I deliberately switched everything up every feature. I would do a feature on Acrofilm with Arri cameras and Zeiss lenses, and I do a Panavision show with Fujifilm, and then I'd do a Panavision film with Kodak film, and I'd use Primo lenses, and so I tried a little of everything. And I'm not particularly in love with just one lens or one camera or any of that, although I do love the Alexa quite a bit. I've been shooting on the Primos for Maisel for a while now, but I did this TV series, Get Shorty, and we did season 1 of Westworld with the Leica Summicron lenses, which I like quite a bit because I like the Master Primes, the Zeiss Master Primes a lot, but they're fairly heavy lenses, and Panavision till recently didn't have their own 1.4 lenses other than their old ultra speeds. So I liked the Master Prime look, but I wanted something a little more lightweight and flexible, and I started using the Leicas, and I liked them quite a bit. And the lens quality is similar to a Primo in a way, so it's good, But I like Master Primes too, so because I often use filtration. I often like to start with the sharpest, cleanest lenses, and then put filter. Yeah.
Nice. And are there particular filters that you almost always use, or do you like to try different things depending on the project?
I collect a bunch of very light versions of everything. Like I have an 8th fog, and I have an 8th double fog, and I have an 8th, frost, and I like those very extremely light filters. But I've been primarily using the Hollywood Black Magics for a long time now, ever since United States of Terror, like 2010 or 9. I started using them. That's pretty much it. On Maisel, I also use the Tiffin Black Diffusion Effects filter. I used that a little on Big Love because they didn't want us to use diffusion, but we needed occasionally to put something on the lens, and so the Tiffin filter is extremely subtle. It's one of the only diffusions you put on, and it actually doesn't look like you put a diffusion. Nothing glows. It just softens the image in a very subtle way. So every now and then on Maisel, when I'm shooting into a bright window or a bright light bulb right behind someone's head, and the Hollywood Black Magic just creates this kind of telltale blurry glow around it, it's too eye-catching, when you're trying to look at the actor's face. So I'll switch to the Tiffin Black Diffusion Effects filter.
Very cool. Nice.
The Radiant Softs are kind of similar to those filters. So.
Nice. I'll do maybe like 1 or 2 more quick questions that people have sent, just because I know you need to go. I don't really know how to expand these. I don't know how to see beyond the dots. Let's see. Do you understand this? Do you remember your favorite scene to shoot in North Fork?
North Fork just was a very wonderful film to shoot in general because we were up in Montana and that beautiful landscape on a small film where we sort of have complete freedom to just sort of shoot amazing storms and scenes. And so Yeah, I mean, just every day there was just something spectacular to photograph, and shooting anamorphic, and I was doing this elaborate process of skip bleaching the prints and flashing the negative heavily. Um, so there was one day. It's nothing major, but there's a couple cool things in the film. One is that it's a winter story, but we had to shoot it in spring because it's heavily daylight dependent. Almost all of it is day interior, day exterior. There's only one night scene, so we needed longer daylight, but we had to have snow everywhere. So we were shooting in late spring in Montana, and the snow was starting to melt. And the Polish brothers were worried that we weren't going to get enough snow, although it snowed several times while we were filming, so we ended up having enough snow. But so they sent me 2 weeks before production began. They sent me to Montana with just a camera and a camera assistant, and my job was just to spend a week in a SUV gathering images of snow. So I would find like some old farmhouse that was rotting in the middle of a prairie covered in snow. I'd film some river that had ice that was melting, and just images of snowy mountains and fields and anything that felt cold and wintry. And normally when you do those sort of second unit mood shots, they don't end up in the final cut because the story doesn't have time to cut away from the action. But what happened in the editing was that the editor, Leo Trombetta, had this interesting idea, is that when the little boy is dying at the end of the story, we had on audio a sermon that Nick Nolte had given. And it was interesting because Nick Nolte had this sermon that he had to give in front of a group of people, and we shot his close-up. And then we turned around on the extras, who are the parishioners of the church. Nolte improvised a sermon to keep their interest up. And his I think his mother had just passed away, and he gave this lovely sermon about spending time with someone who was dying and being honored to be there with them at those last moments. And it was such a beautiful little sermon that he was just sort of improvising, that the editor took those audio and he took my images of snow and landscapes and put them together and created this montage that was sort of the end of the movie. And it just worked out beautifully. And all those shots are in the movie. The other thing was nice was that Nolte was on the Hulk at the time, filming the Hulk, and he showed up late on our show, and there was a day where we had nothing to shoot. All our actors that we had scheduled had done their scenes, and Nick Nolte was a day late showing up for his scenes. And suddenly we were in this old the farmhouse with nothing to shoot, and I spent a half a day just shooting inserts. And again, normally you end up giving inserts to someone else to shoot because you never have time on a schedule. But since there was nothing to shoot, I just spent like a half a day just doing beautifully lit inserts of a tea set or sculptures or objects in the room, and they're all in the movie. And it's great to have these lovingly photographed inserts that normally on a low budget film with a tight schedule, you just get rushed through those sort of things. And here, all the inserts, I had all the time in the world to shoot, so it was great.
That's amazing.